Officer Dean Hayes arrests the wrong black woman. He's shocked in court to learn she's the state's chief prosecutor. What if the very person sworn to uphold the law used their power to break it? A routine patrol takes a dark turn when an officer arrests a woman late at night, only to discover in court that she's the state's chief prosecutor. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you've thought about justice. Stay with me, because this story is one you won't forget. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The city was alive with its usual nighttime hum, a cacophony of distant car horns, murmuring street vendors, and the rhythmic clatter of footsteps on the pavement. The streetlights cast long shadows on the damp asphalt, creating an air of unease. Alexandra Jones, dressed in an elegant navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase, walked briskly along the sidewalk. She had just finished preparing for a high-profile trial, her mind preoccupied with legal strategies and loose ends. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step measured, each thought precise. She was tired but resolute. The upcoming case was a pivotal one, not just for her career, but for the broader fight against systemic injustice. She didn't notice the patrol car idling at the corner until it was too late. Officer Frank Baker sat slouched in the driver's seat, his hand resting lazily on the steering wheel. His partner scrolled through his phone, indifferent to their surroundings, but Frank's eyes locked onto Alexandra as she approached the intersection. Well, he muttered under his breath. What do we have here? His partner barely looked up. Just another late-night walker, man. Let it go. Frank ignored him, straightening in his seat. She's too well-dressed for this neighborhood, carrying a fancy briefcase at this hour. Suspicious. Without waiting for a response, Frank opened the car door and stepped out. His boots splashed into a shallow puddle, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Alexandra paused as he approached, her expression calm but alert. "Evening, ma'am," Frank said, his voice dripping with faux politeness. He placed a hand on his belt, near his holstered weapon. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Alexandra arched an eyebrow. "Walking home. Is that a crime now?" Frank's lips twitched, his patience already thinning. "Depends. You got ID?" Alexandra sighed, setting her briefcase down carefully. "I'm not required to show you my ID unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime." The response clearly irritated Frank. He crossed his arms, his stance widening to assert dominance. "You look out of place. That's enough suspicion for me." Alexandra held his gaze, unflinching. "Out of place in what way, officer?" Frank leaned in slightly, his voice low and condescending. "You tell me. Fancy suit, fancy bag, doesn't exactly scream local. Or maybe you've got something in that briefcase you shouldn't." Alexandra's patience snapped into steel resolve. "Officer, I suggest you tread carefully. You're making baseless assumptions, and I don't have time for this." Frank's partner stepped out of the car, finally sensing the confrontation escalating. "Frank, come on, let it go. She's not worth the paperwork." Frank waved him off, his focus entirely on Alexandra. "Step aside, ma'am. I'm checking your bag." "That won't be happening," Alexandra said firmly. Her voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. "I'm a practicing attorney, and I know my rights. This is unlawful search and seizure." Frank's face darkened. "Big words. Let's see how far they get you." Before Alexandra could react, Frank grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, snapping the handcuffs on with unnecessary force. Her briefcase fell to the ground, scattering papers across the wet pavement. "Hey," she shouted, struggling against his grip. "This is illegal. You're making a huge mistake." Frank yanked her toward the patrol car. "You can tell it to the judge." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. A man stepped forward, phone in hand. "Hey, what are you doing?" "She didn't do anything." Frank turned sharply, his voice barking. "Step back. This is police business." Alexandra met the man's eyes as she was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil. "Please keep recording." The man nodded, his phone camera trained on the scene, as the car doors slammed shut. Inside the patrol car, Alexandra sat in silence, her hands clenched into fists. Every instinct told her to fight back, to demand her release, but she knew better. The system Frank represented thrived on resistance, twisting it into justification. She would fight, but on her terms. Frank climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. You're awfully quiet now. Not so tough, huh? Alexandra didn't respond. Instead, she looked out the window at the receding crowd, her mind already piecing together the chain of events that would follow. She would make sure Frank regretted this night for the rest of his career. The station was dimly lit and buzzing with activity. Officers shuffled between desks, their voices blending into a low hum. Frank dragged Alexandra out of the car, keeping a tight grip on her arm as he marched her inside. Got a troublemaker, he announced loudly, his voice brimming with smug pride. Several officers glanced up, some with curiosity, others with indifference. Alexandra's sharp eyes caught the mix of reactions, filing them away for later. Frank shoved her toward the booking desk. She had all this fancy paperwork and refused to cooperate. Probably some activist playing lawyer. Alexandra stood tall, her eyes locked on the officer behind the desk. I am a lawyer, she said evenly, and you're all going to regret this. Frank laughed, loud and mocking. Oh, sure you are. Let's see how far that gets you in here. As her fingerprints were taken and her belongings catalogued, Alexandra's composure didn't waver. Each indignity, each slight, was another piece of evidence for her case. Her resolve hardened, and though Frank couldn't see it, the scales of justice had already begun to tip against him. As Frank escorted her to a holding cell, Alexandra finally spoke again. You're digging yourself into a hole, officer. When this is over, I suggest you start looking for a new job. Frank scoffed. Keep dreaming, lady. You're just another loudmouth who thinks she's above the law. He locked the cell door with a loud clang and walked away, leaving Alexandra alone in the cold, dim room. She sat on the metal bench, her back straight, her mind racing. Frank had underestimated her, but that was his first mistake. The night was far from over, and Alexandra Jones was just getting started. The sharp clang of the cell door echoed in the confined space, a chilling reminder of Alexandra's new surroundings. The air was heavy with the faint smell of disinfectant and old sweat, and the dim overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the peeling concrete walls. Alexandra remained motionless on the cold metal bench, her posture upright and composed. She was no stranger to injustice, but this time, she wasn't just fighting for others. She was the target. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. A spiderweb crack in the wall, the faint hum of a distant fan, the sound of muffled voices from the adjacent corridor. Everything felt deliberate to her. This wasn't just a holding cell. It was a psychological weapon designed to strip people of their dignity. But Alexandra wasn't someone who could be broken so easily. Back at the front desk, Officer Frank Baker leaned against the counter, his smirk firmly in place. He enjoyed the momentary spotlight as he recounted the night's events to his colleagues. Caught her red-handed, he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the station. Walking around like she owns the place. Thought she could talk her way out of it, too. His partner, Officer Thomas Yet, looked less convinced. You sure about this, Frank? She doesn't exactly scream criminal. Frank waved him off. That's how they get you. Acting all high and mighty. She's hiding something. I can feel it. Thomas hesitated, his gaze flickering to the leather badge case Frank had tossed on the desk earlier. The embossed lettering caught his eye, but before he could reach for it, Frank pulled him aside. Relax, man. She's nothing but a mouthy lawyer wannabe. Trust me, she's not going anywhere. Alexandra heard the sound of approaching footsteps long before the officer appeared. The heavy thud of boots against the linoleum floor announced his arrival like a warning bell. She looked up, her expression neutral, as Frank stopped in front of her cell. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. How's our VIP guest holding up? Alexandra tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without a hint of fear. Enjoying your little moment, officer? You might want to savor it. It won't last. Frank chuckled, leaning against the bars. You're all the same. Big talk until reality hits. Guess what? You're in my world now. Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. And yet, you have no idea who you're dealing with. Frank's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a scoff. Yeah, keep dreaming. You'll have plenty of time to figure out how things work around here. Frank's taunts didn't end there. As he returned to the main room, he made sure his voice carried down the hall. Some people just don't know when to quit, he said loudly. You'd think someone dressed like that would at least have some sense. Laughter erupted from a nearby group of officers. One of them, a younger recruit, chimed in. What's her deal anyway? Businesswoman gone broke. Nah, Frank said, grinning. She's probably one of those activists, you know, the kind that loves screaming about rights until they're in cuffs. Alexandra heard every word. Her fingers tightened into fists on her lap, but she forced herself to stay calm. Emotional outbursts wouldn't help her now. Instead, she let their words fuel her resolve. At the front desk, Officer Thomas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in his chest. Something about the situation felt off. He picked up Alexandra's badge case again, this time opening it fully. His eyes widened as he read the name. Alexandra Jones, Chief Prosecutor of the state. Frank, Thomas called out hesitantly, his voice low. What now? Frank replied, rolling his eyes as he walked over. Thomas handed him the badge without a word. Frank's expression shifted from smug to confused, then to something colder. He glanced toward the holding cells, his jaw tightening. Must be a fake, he muttered, though the uncertainty in his tone was impossible to miss. Thomas frowned. You sure about that? Looks pretty real to me. Frank snapped the badge shut and shoved it into his pocket. Doesn't matter. She's already in custody. In the cell, Alexandra leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes briefly. She was tired, physically and emotionally, but her mind was sharper than ever. She began mentally cataloging everything. Frank's actions, his words, the failure to follow protocol, the mocking comments from the other officers. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a textbook example of systemic abuse of power, and when the time came, she would ensure every detail was brought to light. As the hours passed, the station grew quieter, the overnight shift winding down. Frank had retreated to his desk, pretending to work while occasionally glancing toward the holding cells. Despite his bravado, unease was beginning to creep in. Meanwhile, Thomas took it upon himself to do a little research. A quick internet search confirmed Alexandra Jones's identity. The accompanying articles painted a picture of a formidable legal mind, someone who had dismantled corruption cases and sent high-ranking officials to prison. Thomas's throat tightened. Frank, he said again, this time more urgently, but Frank waved him off. I'll deal with it. Just stick to your job. As dawn began to break, Alexandra sat on the bench, her back straight and her expression serene. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the small, barred window, illuminating her features. She looked more like a warrior preparing for battle than a prisoner awaiting judgment. Her mind was clear, her strategy forming with precision. She would not yell, she would not demand. She would let the system reveal its own corruption, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for Frank Baker to hide. In the distance, she heard a door open. Heavy footsteps approached once more. Alexandra straightened, her heart steady. The moment of reckoning was near. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of morning proceedings. Lawyers shuffled through their case files. Clerks organized stacks of documents, and the occasional murmur from the gallery filled the air. It was a typical day for most in attendance, but not for Alexandra Jones. Seated at the defendant's table, she exuded an aura of quiet confidence. Her sharp navy suit contrasted with the muted beige walls, and her composure seemed to command attention, even in silence. She rested her hands lightly on the polished wooden table, her fingers tapping faintly in a rhythmic pattern. Each tap was deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Across the room, Officer Frank Baker strutted in, his uniform crisp, his smirk firmly in place. He was here to solidify his version of events, secure in his belief that the system would shield him. The judge, a stern figure with sharp glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, called the room to order. Frank took the witness stand, adjusting his tie and straightening his posture. His confidence radiated outward, his tone calm and assertive as he began recounting the events of the previous night. She was acting suspicious, Frank said, his voice steady. Walking alone late at night in a high-crime area, carrying a bag full of papers. When I approached her, she became uncooperative, refusing to show ID. Frank paused for effect, glancing toward the jury. It's my duty to ensure public safety. Her behavior raised red flags, so I made the arrest. From her seat, Alexandra tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing but unreadable. She didn't interrupt, letting Frank weave his narrative without interference. The state's attorney, a young and ambitious prosecutor, rose to her feet. Officer Baker, You mentioned the defendant's behavior was suspicious. Can you clarify what specific actions led you to that conclusion? Frank hesitated for the briefest of moments before replying. She was out of place, dressed too formally for the area, acting defensive when questioned. And by out of place, you mean? The attorney pressed. Frank shifted in his seat, his confident demeanor faltering. She didn't fit the profile of someone who lives in that neighborhood. The prosecutor's eyebrows lifted slightly. So, to clarify, you based your suspicion on her appearance and location? Frank's jaw tightened. Yes, and her refusal to cooperate. The prosecutor nodded, her tone neutral. No further questions. As the judge prepared to move forward, Alexandra rose slowly from her seat. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor turned every head in the room. Her movements were deliberate, her presence commanding. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but resonant. I request permission to represent myself for the remainder of this hearing. The judge looked at her over the rim of his glasses, clearly intrigued. Are you certain, Miss Jones? I am, she replied, her tone unwavering. I believe it will expedite the proceedings. With a nod, the judge granted her request. Alexandra stepped to the podium, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She adjusted the microphone, her calm gaze locking onto Frank, who was now visibly uneasy. Officer Baker, Alexandra began, her voice measured. You testified that my behavior was suspicious. Would you agree that suspicion requires specific, articulable facts? Frank's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Yes. And yet, your testimony just now hinged on subjective observations. My attire, my location. Can you point to a specific law that makes walking in public while dressed professionally a crime? Frank's face reddened. No, but let's move on. Alexandra interrupted smoothly. You claimed I refused to cooperate. Did I not inform you that I am a practicing attorney and that your actions violated my rights? Frank's hands clenched on the edge of the stand. You said something like that, but anyone can make claims. Alexandra's expression didn't waver. Indeed. And yet, you failed to verify my identity when presented with my credentials. Do you have those credentials with you now? The room fell silent as Frank fumbled in his pocket, producing the leather badge case. He handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge examined it. The judge's expression shifted subtly, surprise, then recognition. Miss Jones, he said, his voice slightly softer. This confirms you are the chief prosecutor of the state. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Frank's face drained of color as Alexandra turned back to him, her eyes blazing with quiet intensity. Officer Baker, Alexandra continued, her tone sharper now. Did you, at any point, contact your superior to verify my identity after I informed you of my position? Frank stammered, I didn't think it was necessary. Alexandra's lips pressed into a thin line. And yet, you proceeded to detain me, humiliate me, and fabricate a narrative to justify your actions. Tell me, officer, is that your interpretation of public safety? The tension in the room was palpable. Frank looked to the judge, then the jury, but no one came to his aid. He was alone, exposed. Alexandra turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that the charges against me be immediately dismissed and that this court consider a motion for an investigation into Officer Baker's conduct. His actions represent a gross abuse of power and a violation of my constitutional rights. The judge nodded, his tone solemn. Motion granted. The charges are dismissed. Officer Baker's conduct will be reviewed by Internal Affairs. Frank slumped in his seat, the weight of the moment crushing him. He had underestimated Alexandra Jones, and now the full force of the law was poised to crash down on him. As the courtroom emptied, Alexandra remained standing, her eyes following Frank as he shuffled out, his once confident stride reduced to a defeated shuffle. She had more work to do. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring no one else would suffer the same indignities. Justice, she thought, isn't just about punishment, it's about change. The courthouse hallway was eerily silent after the verdict. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Alexandra as she stepped out, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. The sound echoed, resonating with the weight of the morning's events. Her suit, now a symbol of resilience rather than mere professionalism, carried the authority she had wielded in the courtroom. Alexandra paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The battle was far from over. Frank Baker's humiliation in court was just the beginning. She had exposed his misconduct, But systemic rot didn't crumble with a single blow. It required persistence, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As she straightened her shoulders, a young woman approached her, holding a recorder. "Miss Jones, can I have a statement for the press?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alexandra looked at her, her expression calm but firm. "No comment at this time. The truth will speak for itself." With a polite nod, she walked past her, her focus already shifting to the next steps. Later that afternoon, Alexandra sat in her office, the blinds half drawn against the golden glow of the setting sun. Her desk was meticulously organized, save for the stack of documents and a flash drive containing the night's surveillance footage. She inserted the drive into her laptop, her jaw tightening as she watched the grainy video. A nearby storefront had captured everything. Frank's approach, his aggressive demeanor, the unnecessary force he used while handcuffing her, and the way he had shoved her into the patrol car. She paused the video, her face illuminated by the bluish glow of the screen. Each frame was a piece of damning evidence, a visual indictment of not just Frank, but the culture that enabled him. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "This isn't just about me," she murmured to herself. "It's about everyone who's been silenced, dismissed, or brutalized." Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Frank sat in the corner of the locker room, his head in his hands. The smug confidence he had carried earlier was now replaced with dread. The whispers from his colleagues, some mocking, others concerned, felt like knives in his back. "Did you hear?" One officer whispered to another near the doorway. "She's the chief prosecutor. How did Frank not recognize her?" "I'm telling you, man, this is going to blow up," the other replied. "Internal Affairs is already sniffing around." The captain entered abruptly, his face grim. He motioned for Frank to follow him into his office. Once inside, the door closed with a sharp click. "Baker, what the hell were you thinking?" the captain barked, slamming a folder onto the desk. "Do you have any idea the kind of storm you've brought down on this department?" Frank stammered, trying to find an excuse, but the captain held up a hand. "Save it. We've got surveillance footage, witness statements, and now a civil rights lawsuit breathing down our necks. You're suspended until further notice. Hand in your badge and gun." The words hit Frank like a sledgehammer. His hands trembled as he unpinned his badge and placed it on the desk, followed by his service weapon. The reality of his situation began to sink in. He was no longer untouchable. The following day, Alexandra held a small press conference on the courthouse steps. Her tone was measured, her words carefully chosen. Yesterday's events were a stark reminder that no one is above accountability, not even those entrusted to enforce the law. "This isn't about me. It's about a system that allows misconduct to thrive unchecked. I will be filing a civil rights lawsuit, not just to seek justice for myself, but to ensure that meaningful change follows." The crowd of reporters erupted with questions, but Alexandra raised a hand to silence them. "This is only the beginning. Justice isn't just a concept. It's an action, and I intend to see it through." As she walked away, the resolve in her eyes was unmistakable. She had planted the seeds of change, and now it was time to nurture them. In the weeks that followed, Alexandra's case became a flashpoint. News outlets picked up the story, sparking debates about systemic bias and police accountability. Frank's name was now synonymous with misconduct, and the precinct faced mounting pressure to reform. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation, uncovering not just Frank's history of discriminatory behavior, but also a pattern of similar incidents within the department. Several officers were placed on leave, and the public demanded transparency. Alexandra watched the developments from her office, a quiet satisfaction settling over her, but she knew this was just the surface. Real change required more than exposing wrongdoing. It required dismantling the structures that allowed it to persist. Late one evening, Alexandra returned home, the weight of the week finally catching up to her. She set her briefcase down and poured herself a glass of wine, standing by the window as the city lights twinkled in the distance. Her mind wandered to the countless faces she had encountered in her career, victims of injustice, families torn apart, communities scarred by inequality. She thought of her younger self, full of idealism, determined to change the world. Tonight, she felt that fire reignite. "This is just the start," she whispered to herself, her reflection staring back at her with steely determination. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. The precinct was quieter than usual. The once bustling office space, filled with the chatter of officers exchanging stories, was now steeped in unease. Frank Baker's desk, usually surrounded by laughter and camaraderie, sat empty, a stark reminder of how quickly the tides had turned. The phone calls had slowed, the paperwork piled higher than usual, and the weight of Alexandra Jones's actions lingered like an invisible fog. Frank sat in his small apartment, the air heavy with stale coffee and regret. The local news was a relentless cascade of stories about the ongoing investigation at his precinct. His name was mentioned too often, each utterance like a fresh wound. Officer Frank Baker, currently under suspension, is at the center of a high-profile civil rights lawsuit filed by Chief Prosecutor Alexandra Jones, the anchor stated. Frank gritted his teeth and muted the TV. He stared at the pile of unopened mail on his kitchen counter, subpoenas, notices from internal affairs, and a few hate-filled letters from members of the public. He had tried to convince himself it would blow over, but the truth was impossible to ignore. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He let it go to voicemail. It was likely another call he couldn't answer. Lawyers, investigators, or perhaps a reporter looking for a soundbite. Back at the precinct, the captain stood at the front of the briefing room, his face etched with frustration. The officers in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he addressed the fallout. "This department is under scrutiny like never before," he said, his voice sharp. "Officer Baker's actions have put all of us under the microscope. Internal Affairs is digging into every complaint, every case, every report. If there's anything they can find, they will." One officer raised a hand cautiously. "Captain, what does this mean for us? Are they looking to shut us down?" The captain sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "It means we're cleaning house. Effective immediately, all personnel are required to attend mandatory bias training. Every complaint against this department will be re-examined. And if you've got skeletons in your closet, now's the time to come forward." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers looked outraged. Others wore expressions of resignation. Alexandra's case wasn't just about Frank. It was unraveling the entire culture of complacency within the precinct. In her office, Alexandra sat across from a team of attorneys and activists, reviewing the progress of her lawsuit. The atmosphere was focused but determined. Charts and folders filled the conference table, each one detailing the history of complaints against Frank Baker and the precinct as a whole. "This isn't just about one officer," Alexandra said, her voice steady. "It's about dismantling a system that enables this kind of behavior. We're going to push for policy changes, community oversight, and accountability measures." One attorney nodded. "We're also seeing an outpouring of support from advocacy groups and local organizations. People are rallying behind you." Alexandra allowed herself a small smile. "Good. Let's make sure this momentum doesn't die. Change needs more than outrage. It needs action." The lawsuit sparked a wave of public protests, with citizens demanding reforms in law enforcement. Crowds gathered outside the precinct with signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Police Impunity." The media captured the energy of the movement, amplifying voices that had long been ignored. For Alexandra, the protests were a reminder of why she had taken this fight so personally. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. Every face in the crowd represented a story like hers, and every chant was a call for accountability. Weeks of mounting pressure began to wear Frank down. His suspension turned into an indefinite leave without pay, and rumors circulated that Internal Affairs had found evidence of past misconduct in his record. The walls were closing in, and Frank had no one left to turn to. Sitting in the dark of his apartment one night, he stared at his reflection in a half-empty glass of whiskey. The man looking back at him was no longer the confident officer who had strutted into the courtroom. He was a shadow of himself, consumed by guilt, fear, and resentment. A knock at the door broke the silence. When Frank opened it, he found a manila envelope on the floor. Inside was a letter from his attorney. "The department will not be defending you in court. You are on your own." Frank's hands trembled as he read the words. He had always believed the badge would protect him, but now he realized how easily the system abandoned its own when the spotlight became too bright. Alexandra's lawsuit led to sweeping changes in the city's police department. A civilian oversight board was established to review misconduct cases, and mandatory body cameras were implemented for all officers. Frank's trial became a symbol of accountability, a cautionary tale for others in positions of power. Other victims began to come forward, inspired by Alexandra's courage. Their stories added fuel to the fire, creating a domino effect of change that reverberated far beyond the city. One evening, Alexandra returned to her childhood neighborhood, walking along the familiar streets where she had first dreamed of becoming a lawyer. She stopped outside a small park, where children played, their laughter ringing out against the fading light. A young girl approached her, holding a notebook. "Are you the lady on TV?" she asked shyly. Alexandra knelt down, her smile warm. "I guess I am. What's your name?" "Lisa," the girl replied, clutching her notebook tighter. "I want to be a lawyer like you someday." Alexandra's chest swelled with emotion. She reached into her bag and pulled out a pen. "Then start here, Lisa. Write down every idea, every dream, and don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do." As Lisa ran off, Alexandra stood and looked out over the park. The fight wasn't over, but moments like these reminded her why it was worth it. Months later, the courtroom was packed again, but this time, Frank Baker sat at the defendant's table. His once pristine uniform was replaced by a plain suit, and the confidence he had once worn like armor was now a distant memory. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through a binder of defense notes, though the strain on their face betrayed the difficulty of the case. Alexandra sat in the gallery, watching the proceedings unfold. She had chosen not to serve as the lead prosecutor, opting instead to observe as a plaintiff. The lead attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense advocate named Valerie Ortiz, was more than capable of carrying the torch. The trial revealed not just Frank's actions, but also his pattern of behavior. Former victims testified, recounting incidents of racial profiling, unnecessary force, and intimidation. Each story was another brick in the wall of evidence against him. The surveillance footage from Alexandra's arrest was the most damning, played on a large screen for all to see. When Frank took the stand, his demeanor was subdued. He stammered through excuses, blaming stress, workload, and even the dangerous environment of his beat. But under cross-examination, Valerie dismantled his defenses piece by piece. "Officer Baker," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "is it not true that your actions on the night of Miss Jones's arrest violated department protocol?" Frank hesitated. "I may have misjudged the situation." "Misjudged?" Valerie echoed. "Or were you so confident in your ability to act with impunity that you never expected to face consequences?" Frank's silence spoke louder than any answer he could have given. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson delivered a resounding verdict: guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. Frank's sentencing was set for a later date, but the weight of the verdict was already palpable. As Frank was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the gallery erupted in hushed murmurs. Alexandra remained seated, her expression neutral. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only resolve to continue her work. The trial's outcome sent shockwaves through the city. It became a landmark case, spurring police reforms that had long been resisted. The Civilian Oversight Board, empowered by public support, began reviewing cases with newfound vigor. Officers like Frank, once shielded by the blue wall of silence, found themselves facing overdue accountability. Community leaders, inspired by Alexandra's case, partnered with local officials to implement initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. These changes were incremental, but they were real. Frank's sentencing hearing was held a month later. The judge handed down a prison sentence, citing his blatant disregard for the law and the public trust. He was also stripped of his pension, a final blow that left him financially ruined. In prison, Frank found himself at the mercy of the very system he had once manipulated. The isolation and hostility he faced mirrored the treatment he had inflicted on others. The fall from power was complete. In the years that followed, Alexandra's work continued to impact lives. The lawsuit settlement she won against the precinct was used to fund community programs, legal aid for underserved populations, and scholarships for aspiring lawyers from marginalized backgrounds. She also became a sought-after speaker, traveling the country to advocate for justice reform. Her story inspired countless others to stand up against injustice, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. One evening, Alexandra returned to her office after a long day. The sun had set, casting a golden hue across the city skyline visible through her window. She sat at her desk, looking over the latest reports from the Oversight Board. Progress was slow, but it was steady. A knock at the door broke her concentration. It was Lisa, the young girl she had met years earlier at the park, now a high school senior. Lisa held up an acceptance letter to a prestigious law school. "I just wanted to say thank you," Lisa said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You showed me what was possible." Alexandra stood, smiling warmly. "You did this yourself, Lisa, but I'm proud of you. The world needs your voice." As Lisa left, Alexandra sat back down, her heart full. She glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, a picture of her younger self, standing in front of her first courtroom. Beneath it was a quote she lived by: "Justice is not a destination, it's a journey." The city continued to evolve, shaped by the lessons learned from Alexandra's case. The precinct, once a symbol of unchecked power, became a model for transparency and accountability. Police-community relations improved, though the scars of the past remained a reminder of the work still to be done. And Alexandra, ever the fighter, remained at the forefront of the movement. She knew the battle for justice was never truly over, but she also knew that change, once set in motion, was unstoppable. The weeks following Frank Baker's sentencing felt like a turning point for the city. Headlines praised the unprecedented accountability brought to the police department, while others speculated about the long-term impact of Alexandra Jones's fight for justice. The streets buzzed with conversations about what this victory meant for the community, especially for those who had felt invisible under the weight of systemic injustice. For Alexandra, the work was far from done. While her case had become a symbol of hope, she knew the battle against entrenched systems of power required more than a single victory. Change was a marathon, not a sprint. In the heart of the city, a small community center buzzed with life. A banner over the entrance read, "Justice starts here," the tagline for a new initiative funded by Alexandra's lawsuit settlement. Inside, a group of young people gathered around a table, listening intently to a volunteer explaining their rights during police interactions. "Remember, knowledge is your greatest weapon," the volunteer said. "The more you know, the harder it is for anyone to exploit you." Alexandra observed quietly from the back of the room, a soft smile on her face. Moments like this were why she fought so hard. The lawsuit wasn't just about accountability, it was about empowerment. Every young person who left the center with newfound confidence was a step toward dismantling the systems that had allowed Frank Baker to thrive. Across town, Frank sat in a stark prison cell, the pale light from a single bulb casting shadows on the walls. He stared at the tray of food in front of him, barely touched. The world outside continued without him, but he was stuck, replaying his downfall over and over. In the yard, during recreation time, he felt the weight of his new reality. Other inmates watched him, some with contempt, others with amusement. He had once carried himself with arrogance, confident in his authority. Now he walked with his head down, stripped of the power that had once shielded him. A fellow inmate approached him one day, leaning against the fence. "So, you're the cop who got taken down by a prosecutor, huh?" the man said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Frank said nothing, his silence a stark contrast to the bravado he had once exuded. The humiliation of his fall was compounded by the realization that he had no allies, no safety net, and no way to undo the damage he had caused to himself and others. Alexandra's calendar was busier than ever. Between public speaking engagements, community meetings, and legal cases, her days were packed, yet she approached each task with the same unwavering determination. At one such event, a town hall meeting, a young man stood up during the Q&A session. "Miss Jones, do you ever feel like the system is too broken to fix?" Cassandra paused, her gaze steady. "There are days when it feels overwhelming," she admitted. "But the system only stays broken if we stop pushing for change. Every voice, every action, no matter how small, adds to the momentum. Justice is a journey, and we're all walking it together." The room erupted in applause, her words resonating deeply with those in attendance. The Civilian Oversight Board Alexandra helped establish grew stronger over time. It became a model for other cities grappling with similar issues, proving that systemic reform was possible when communities demanded it. The police department underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership prioritized transparency and accountability, and officers who resisted the changes found themselves forced out. For the first time in years, trust between law enforcement and the community began to rebuild. Alexandra's name became synonymous with justice, not because she sought fame, but because her work inspired real, tangible change. One quiet evening, Alexandra stood in her living room, looking at a framed article on the wall. The headline read, "Prosecutor Sparks Justice Reform After Landmark Case." Beneath it was a photo of her leaving the courtroom, her head held high. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email from a publisher, offering her the chance to write a book about her experiences. Alexandra hesitated for a moment before replying. Sharing her story could inspire others, and that was a legacy worth leaving. She typed her response, "Let's do it." Years later, the city had transformed. The community center had expanded, becoming a hub for education and empowerment. Police misconduct complaints had significantly decreased, and officers who once viewed accountability as a threat now saw it as a guiding principle. On a sunny afternoon, Alexandra walked through the park where she had first met Lisa. She saw the young woman again, now a law school graduate, speaking to a group of children about pursuing their dreams. As Cassandra watched, a sense of pride swelled within her. The fight for justice was far from over, but the seeds she had planted were growing stronger every day. She turned to leave, her steps light but purposeful. Justice, she thought, was a journey, and she was still walking it. And so, justice prevailed, reminding us all that no one is above the law. Alexandra Jones's courage not only brought accountability, but also ignited change that will impact generations to come. What do you think about her fight for justice? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories. See you in the next one.